Hello and welcome to the introductory episode of the Life with Color podcast. I'm your host, Katie Noyet, and I'm so excited to launch this podcast with you today. In the Life with Color podcast, I will examine the intersection between eating disorders and societies around the world, and how one's societal and cultural surroundings may contribute to disordered thinking. Every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Central European Time, this podcast will feature exclusive interviews with professionals on topics related to eating disorders, mental health, and nutrition. It will also highlight stories of recovery and hope with people who have experienced symptoms, treatment, and recovery in different countries around the world. Have you ever wondered what society is like in Denmark and what eating disorder treatment and recovery is like there? What about in Dubai or Australia? If you're curious about any of these ideas, the Life with Color podcast is for you. Now, you may be wondering who I am and why I'm so passionate about eating disorders and international societies. To start, I struggled with an eating disorder for about 4 years of my life. It was during high school, as an international exchange student in Denmark, and during the start of my college career. After receiving treatment back in 2014, I'm proud to say that I'm now 6 years in recovery and I'm passionate about helping others find peace within themselves and their bodies. For me, advocacy work has played a big part of my own recovery. In 2016, I founded the annual Bend, Oregon NEDA Walk with the National Eating Disorder Association as a way to bring resources and support to Central Oregon regarding eating disorders. In addition to being a coordinator and a volunteer for this event, I spoke around the state of Oregon and with the media on topics related to eating disorders. Along the way, I met hundreds of professionals in the field, as well as individuals affected by eating disorders, some of whom will be guests on the show. The international and societal lens this podcast looks through is due to my educational background and my experiences abroad. In 2018, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in social science with a focus on psychology, sociology, and political science. These studies taught me how to look at different societies and cultures with a critical lens and develop new and innovative ways of moving forward. In addition to my education, I've lived abroad, first as an exchange student in Denmark, then as an academic English teacher in the United Arab Emirates, and finally as a soon-to-be graduate student in Denmark, the home base for the Life with Color podcast. Simply put, this podcast combines my two greatest passions, eating disorder awareness and international societal studies. I decided to develop the Life with Color podcast for 3 reasons. The first was because I saw a need for it. Through conversations with internationals in Denmark, I discovered that not all countries have the same approach or even level of care when it comes to eating disorders. The Life with Color podcast is not only intended as a means of supporting those affected internationally, but also acts as a conversation starter and a resource for living a full life in recovery. The second reason why I started this podcast was for educational purposes. Oftentimes, friends and family members are at a loss of how they can best support their loved one who is struggling with an eating disorder. The Life with Color podcast seeks to familiarize listeners with topics related to eating disorders, as well as provide accurate and up-to-date information on topics not limited to eating disorders, nutrition, and mental health, all while offering external resources along the way. The final reason is connection. Eating disorders thrive off of isolation. This podcast is set up to combat that through offering conversational programming to help people feel connected and heard. Whether you have just started your journey to recovery, are many years into recovery, or even if you have no connection to eating disorders at all, the Life with Color podcast is for you. The last thing I want to cover today is the name of this podcast. Why Life with Color? What do eating disorders have to do with color? The answer is everything. Some of the darkest days in my life happened when I was in the depths of my eating disorder. It was as if I had a pair of gray tinted glasses on that plagued the way I saw the world. These glasses strained my relationship with food and movement. They manipulated my thoughts and beliefs about myself, and they stole countless experiences away from me. These glasses also enforced black and white thinking, where I would either feel 100% perfect or a complete and utter failure. There was no room for mistakes, no room for self-compassion, and least of all, there was no room for joy. But recovery is different. Recovery is taking off those manipulative, gray-tinted glasses and seeing the world for what it is, one full of variety, hope, possibility, and one full of color. Recovery is learning to live again and experiencing the freedom of knowing that all foods fit and the freedom to live a life without chains. Recovery is the process of unlearning our society's toxic messages about what we should eat, what we should look like, what we should achieve, and learning how to be kind to yourself along the way. Recovery is the ongoing healing process of discovering yourself. It's the empowering exercise of using your voice, taking up space, and moving forward in a way that's compassionate and honest and authentic with your true self. But make no mistake, recovery is not a perfect process. Not at all. Recovery is about embracing the unknown and being kind to yourself along the way. Some days may be better than others, but in the end, recovery is about coming out of the strict rigidness of darkness and emerging into a life with diversity, love, and color. Recovery is limitless. Recovery is life with color.